Now, like a lot of transport nerds, I'm a big fan of the Elizabeth line. It's London's newest railway line, having opened in 2022. But the idea behind it is a lot older and went through a lot of iterations. Today I'd like to talk about two versions of the concept from the 1930s. One of the major aims of the Elizabeth line is to relieve overcrowding on the Central line. But overcrowding has been a problem on the Central line for decades, even back in the 1930s. Back then there was a lot less Central line than there is now. It ran from Liverpool Street at its eastern end to Ealing Broadway at the western end. There was no West Ruislip branch, there was no line to Epping, there was no Hainault loop. In 1933, the London Passenger Transport Board came into being. This organisation, better known as London Transport, was in charge of all public transport in London. Tubes, buses, trams. It even had some say over what the main line railways did. In 1935, they announced the New Works programme. This would fulfil two functions. One, it would standardise the network, bringing consistency and modernisation. And two, it would improve and expand the network. Part of the latter involved taking over some of the main line railways in the London suburbs and adding them to the Underground. The Central line would inherit some of those. In the west, it would take over the line as far as Denham from the Great Western Railway. In the east, a new tunnel would be dug from Liverpool Street to Stratford, and it would take over the branch lines to Ongar and Ilford. Another tunnel would be dug from Leytonstone to Newbury Park. This would add several miles and several stations to the Central line. But hold on a second. The Central line was already overcrowded. Those new stations would be funneling even more people onto a line that realistically couldn't take much more. So London Transport sent some of its senior bods to New York to look into the concept of increasing capacity. New York was, then as now, a busy and extensive city with a busy and extensive subway system. So it seemed like a pretty good point of comparison with London. The delegation came back with three possible solutions. 1. Longer stations and longer trains. 2. Faster trains. And 3. Express lines. Now, express services were nothing new on the Underground, but in most cases they shared their tracks with stopping services. What the London Transport delegation proposed was separate tunnels dedicated purely to express trains, running below the existing tunnels. Something similar had been proposed for the District line at the start of the century, but they'd built the Piccadilly line instead. 3 sets of proposals were made, one for the Northern line, one for the Bakerloo line, and one for the Central line. The Central was seen as top priority. The express section would have been the 3.5 miles at the core, from Marble Arch to Liverpool Street. There would only have been 4 stations on this section: Marble Arch, Oxford Circus, Bank, and Liverpool Street. Trains could terminate at either end or go on to Denham, Ealing Broadway, Ilford, or Ongar. It was estimated that trains on the express line would manage the journey in half the time of the stopping trains. The proposal was refined a little in 1938. This version of the concept removed Bank, which seems a little odd. Bank is one of the most important interchanges on the tube network. The Express Central Line scheme was never made public, and by 1939 this version had been dropped. In 1939, the Second World War broke out. Experts were firmly of the opinion that air power would be a key factor in this conflict. It had been a key factor in the Spanish Civil War. And while the government were initially opposed to the idea of people sheltering underground for fear that they wouldn't bother coming out again during the day, the Blitz gave them a sharp dose of reality. So in 1940, the government and London Transport looked into the construction of deep-level shelters at certain locations. These would house people during the conflict, and afterwards they could be joined together to form express tunnels. As London Transport were good at digging holes, construction would be their responsibility. The Home Office would own the shelters until the end of the conflict, whereupon they would be sold to London Transport. This prompted the latter to dust off the Central Line Express route plan. This version would be much shorter, only going between Bank and Holborn. The deep-level shelters would be located at the two stations this line skipped, St Paul's and Chancery Lane. One early plan would have put a shelter between Liverpool Street and Bethnal Green, which I assume would have been part of the connection to Stratford, but that was never built. The incomplete station was used as a shelter, though. The shelter at St Paul's was stymied pretty early on. In 1935, the City of London St Paul's Preservation Act had been passed, which strictly forbade any underground works that might put the cathedral at risk. Armed with this, the cathedral authorities complained in the strongest possible terms about the plans to dig tunnels in their vicinity. London Transport looked at resiting the tunnels further away from the cathedral, but eventually gave up. The Chancery Lane shelter actually did get built, although it was used for certain official government departments rather than the public. It would later be used as a nuclear bomb-proof telephone exchange as part of the Cold War communications network, and I believe it has recently been sold off. By 1942, it seemed that London Transport had lost their appetite for the express tubes concept, and they told the Home Office that they probably wouldn't be using the new shelters anytime soon. Although they did retain the right to buy the shelters off the government after the war, they never exercised these. In 1945, the Daily Mail and the Daily Express excitedly reported that the plans actually were going ahead. It may surprise you to learn that these August journals were wrong, and London Transport made a press release explaining that no, there were to be no express tube lines. After the war, the focus switched. The County of London plan envisaged a whole new network of underground railway lines. But this was gradually cut back until what we eventually got was the Victoria Line, and, later still, the Jubilee Line. It seemed that the Central Line had gone from something that urgently needs to be dealt with right now, to something that could wait. And so it did, until 2022 and the arrival of the Elizabeth Line. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this deep-level tale from the Tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. For more on what happened with the deep-level shelters and their planning, I would recommend Andrew Emerson and Tony Beard's book, London Secret Tubes, which was by far my biggest source on this. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the connecting tunnels to my underground bunker. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.